In the U.S., about 1 million children under the age of 18 have permanent hearing loss. This means that approximately 1 million children are having decisions made for them about their futures. Many parents aren't informed about these choices that they have to make. They don't know their options, and they aren't aware that deaf children learn very differently than hearing children. Deaf children obviously have to be taught to hear if they have any hearing at all. They have to be taught to speak and how to just function as we all do normally. We often, as babies, children, we learn to see how people interact because we can hear what's going on, and obviously deaf children can't do that. Based on the child's hearing loss, there are options. Some that embrace deafness and also help the child to be successful in society. And parents have to be aware of these options so that their child can be successful. First, parents need to know that there are two options in deafness. This often comes as a surprise to many. People just think, okay, you're deaf, end of story. But there are two types of deafness. They categorize these as little d deaf and big D deaf. In spelling, you'll see deaf spelled literally with a little d or big D, but there are drastic differences between the two. Little d is generally categorized as a medical dysfunction. This just means that the person is deaf, they have hearing loss, they cannot hear. Big D deaf involves culture. If someone is big D deaf, they are culturally deaf. They have chosen deafness as their choice. They don't want to be hearing. It's not a disability to be deaf to them. There's a deaf community, a language that's used by deaf people, heritage, traditions, and pride. As I said, they don't care to be hearing people. They are deaf and they're proud of it. The important thing about big D and little d is the parent usually makes the decision on if the child becomes big D or little d deaf based on the educational option they choose for their child. Whichever is chosen generally will cause the child to, it changes their life, whichever one is chosen. It is a huge decision and most parents aren't aware of that decision and they don't know what a big deal it is. Generally, people who have a lesser hearing loss will choose options that include cochlear implants or hearing aids. So sometimes these options don't apply to them in the same way as someone who has a greater hearing loss that have no way of ever being able to actually hear. Along with those come categories of language. Generally, when little d deaf is chosen, that means the child will be treated as an oral child. They will be taught in school how to lip read, how to speak, how to hear, even if they have no hearing. They'll be taught to practice how to hear. And sign language will be used, but it's a different type of sign language. Generally, when they're taught they're taught in the schools with oral, C or C2 is used. And as an example, for the word butterfly, it would be taught the sign butter and then the sign for fly. And so that's how a child would learn a word, is by breaking it down into what the subcategories of the word are. Big D, that would be total communication, which is oral, but you add American Sign Language, which is a language. It is, valid as a language, which most people don't know either. It has been tested and approved as an actual language. And as an example, butterfly would be signed like this, which looks like a butterfly, gives a visual presentation for the child to understand. There are also categories of education that go with big D and little d deaf. Little d deaf, usually the child is mainstreamed, which means they attend a school that is mostly hearing students. They may be in a classroom with other deaf children, but generally the school, the teachers, the principals, etc. are hearing. There are pros and cons both to mainstream schools and mainstreaming students, and a pro of that is that they are taught to operate in a hearing world. They're submerged into a hearing world. However, they don't have deaf mentors or peers to look up to or to see that it's okay that they're deaf. They feel different. They know they're different. They see that they're different. Children get to live at home with their families if they go to a mainstream school, but there could be a language barrier at home if the parents haven't taken the time to learn how to communicate with their child, which happens very often. The student can feel very at home or alone when they're at home. There's a variety of academic classes However, some classes aren't targeted toward deaf students at all, i.e. band, music, choir. If they can't hear the music, if they're very likely not to be interested in the music, which isn't the case for all deaf students, but many of them get frustrated with classes like that. There are interpreters. Often a lot of schools who have mainstream programs will use interpreters. However, there is no standard qualifications for educational interpreters, which means if your child is taking a class like biology, chemistry, classes that are often on the higher difficulty levels, the interpreter may have no knowledge of the actual subject, which can obviously cause problems for the student who's trying to learn the subject. Students can miss information from the teacher if they're lip reading. Studies show that lip readers often only actually intake 25 to 35% of what they lip read. And so, obviously, on an exam, 25 to 35% of the knowledge is a problem. Also, in the classroom, other students who talk to each other, teachers who might interact, questions that might be asked might not be interpreted to the student, so they miss what's going on in the classroom. Language and communication barriers are obvious, and they can cause stress for the students. Just in general, school can be stressful for a hearing student, so adding language barriers on top of that can cause even more problems. It slows the teacher down sometimes when there are interpreters in the class, because they're supposed to stop and ask the interpreter if the student is getting the information, if they need to go back, and they have to treat that student as the other students. And so, because there's an interpreter, it can often slow down the teacher. And then in mainstream schools, they're rarely taught deaf culture. They're not taught to be proud of being deaf at all. For Big D deaf, often when they choose this route, that means the student will be in a residential school, which means they will attend a school and they will live there during the week and go home on the weekends. Residential schools are based in American Sign Language. If the teachers aren't deaf, then they use American Sign Language. There are some hearing teachers, but generally all the staff, principals, etc. are all deaf. There are also pros and cons to the residential schools. They're usually far from the family. The students will have to live far from their families because they'll have to attend the residential school. And sometimes these schools, there are sometimes only one per state. And so that means that the parents either relocate to see their student or their child every weekend, or the child stays at the school during the weekends. Deaf identity is promoted, obviously, because it's a huge deaf community. Language abilities are improved. They not only use ASL, but they also teach English as a language, as a written and oral language. So the student does learn how to read and write as a hearing student. Equipment is designed for deaf students, like the bells flash instead of ring, phones vibrate, flash, whatever, instead of do things that are to be heard. Alarms do the same thing, so the students are in a safe environment that is made for them. There's access to deaf role models and mentors. There's a wide variety of extracurriculars because they live at the school. They can obviously participate as much as they want to. It builds them a network of deaf friends, people that they can relate to. But often the equipment at deaf schools are outdated because they receive less funding. So the books are older, the equipment's older, sometimes it affects the students negatively. Also, the dorm supervisors have high turnover rates. It can be a tough job to have to live with, a whole bunch of teenagers, hearing or deaf, but that causes less stability for the students. Making decisions for deaf people when you're a hearing person can be difficult and probably seems a little silly sometimes. You say, how can you put yourself in that position? But personally, I feel that choosing Big D deaf benefits the students the most, mainly because the child will feel that they belong somewhere. If the child is deaf and they are trying to be a hearing child, they can't be hearing because they are physically incapable of hearing. So the deaf community won't accept them into their deaf community because they don't want to be deaf. And then it's hard to fit into the hearing community because they can't hear. So it leaves a very strange place for this child to be. Hearing people are accepted into the deaf culture, but there are things that you have to know. You have to respect them and understand that it's their culture and you can't put it down. There's more effective learning because there's a whole spectrum of communication. All aspects of communication are used. Lip reading, speaking, listening, signing. Those are all very important.